Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of JTV, specifically the Jewish Wisdom segment. We're extremely delighted to be joined virtually by Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz, who is no stranger to JTV. We've had him on in the past and his videos have been extremely popular, so we're really delighted to have you back again. Rabbi, how are you and how have you been coping over the last few months?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for hosting me again on your show. I'm a great JTV admirer. Would like to acknowledge and praise you for your initiative in starting this program. I think it's remarkable. A real opportunity to change the Jewish world in a significant fashion. So it's an honor to be with you. Thank you very much and my compliments. Last few months have been fun. I must say my work has been relatively unaffected. On the one hand, I speak to a lot more people than I usually do because it's the international reach. On the other hand, it's a little bit more difficult to connect with people when you don't see the whites of their eyes. Sometimes in large groups where you don't see the faces on the screen. So, you know, there's a trade-off, but so far we seem to be coping. And I think we've, speaking on behalf of the JLE, I think we've leveraged this medium into some very powerful applications.
Absolutely. I think in some ways there's been, terrible suffering that's been experienced, and there's also been new opportunities which have emerged as a result of this complete change in dynamic. And I think in some ways the world may be changed for the better in terms of communication and reaching far more people than would have been done before. And thank you so much also for your kind comments about JTV. They mean a lot, and the feeling of admiration is very much mutual. Can we start by jumping in? We've got about 4 or 5 different topics that we'd love to cover with you today. And I want to start with something which I thought, this is a virus that is separate to the coronavirus, and I thought it was something that would perhaps be less of a focus as this whole coronavirus pandemic swept the world. But it's the other virus of anti-Semitism, which, as Rabbi Sachs, I think, puts it, is a virus which is very effective at mutating. We Jewish people find themselves astonished today to see, just recently we've had this rapper, musician called Ollie, who openly and proudly stated anti-Semitic views. And Jewish people, but also when it comes to the demonization and victimization of Israel, Jewish people feel so astonished in the aftermath of the Holocaust in this post or anti-racist world that we're now supposedly living in. And the way it's mutated so effectively is that the Jewish people are now the racists, the oppressors, the committers of genocide and apartheid. And so that's how it's mutated to guarantee its effectiveness today. And I really wanted to, because I don't believe you can explain anti-Semitism without looking at it from a spiritual perspective as well, because it is just so impossible to explain otherwise. Why is the world so obsessed with this tiny people? So I really wanted to get your perspective on what's really going on. Does the Torah, does Judaism have any answers to the deeper roots of what's really happening with anti-Semitism, how we can best understand it and how we can best address it?
Yes, with your permission, Ollie, I'd like to speak rather less about this subject than others because at a very deep level, it is beyond understanding. So it's one of those subjects that silence is probably more cogent in addressing than argument. But let's say a few things about it, noting that the root of this is beyond human understanding. First of all, you're quite correct. It's a virulent and timeless problem. Completely unreasonable. Let me hasten to add, when I say unreasonable, I don't mean that Jews don't often do things that provoke anti-Semitism unnecessarily. Let's not forget that. There's some things that there's standards that we could raise our standards in many ways, which would be correct in their own right and would deflect some of the anti-Semitic element. Let's look to our own faults first before we lash out. There's no question about that. But I can assure you that even if we behave perfectly, or virtually perfectly, there would still be this problem in the modern world. And it's a completely intractable and unreasonable problem. As you say, first of all, we're a tiny shred of humanity. That's true. On the other hand, we've not had a tiny shred of effect on humanity. Let's not forget that either. We are the ones who brought the modern Western tradition of morality to the world. The 3 great Western religions are solidly based on us. The Far East is something different entirely, discussion for another time. So although we are tiny, we're certainly punching above our weight in terms of international effect. They're quite correct about that. When they say the Jews are involved in everything, and in one sense the Jews want to take over the world, there's a truth in that. Not the way they think. We wouldn't like to take over the world in their political system, but we'd certainly like to take over the world by foisting our morality and values on the world. No question about that. And the non-Jewish world knows that, and of course that's correct. As Rabbi Sachs, you quoted, he put it very well. It's not religion that's the problem. He said it's bad religion that's the problem. And he's quite right about that. Second point is, not only are we small, but just as an indicator or measure of the anti-Semitic issue, I think you can look at Israel. You know, they fuss about Israel, right? Just to give you one small dimension of insight, they would like to make a two-state solution in Israel. I would like to ask you, where will you fit the second state? You know, Israel is small enough that you can run across it in a day. You know that if you jog at a leisurely pace, you will cross it in a day. I mean, I used to live in Telstone, which is just a few kilometers from Jerusalem, and it used to take me 45 minutes to drive to the sea, which is Tel Aviv. You know, you can easily run across the country in a day, and you can drive the length of the country in a few hours. You know, I happen to be South African, Ollie, and the way I think about it is that you could comfortably fit Israel into the Kruger National Park. You know, so you're talking about a tiny sliver of land. And despite that, many Israelis are prepared to countenance a two-state solution, which is absolutely remarkable. I mean, you look at the 5 Arab countries surrounding Israel. You know, there's enough space to absorb the Palestinians without noticing it. But it's Israel who has to sacrifice its land for the Palestinians. So, you know, it's completely disproportionate, the amount of fuss and bother about a tiny sliver of land, which is clearly, if any nation has historical claim on the land, it certainly has to be us. I mean, we have a far more solid claim on the land than the Australians or the Americans or anyone else, no question about that. So yes, it's intractable, inveterate problem. It is unreasonable. It's lethal, dangerous. It mutates all the time. I saw recently a survey done among Eastern European teenagers. Do you know that 20% of them have never heard of the Holocaust? 20% of Eastern European Polish teenagers in a high school classroom, not only not taught about it officially, have never heard about it, which means, very clearly and very frighteningly, I'm talking about a modern survey done recently, this means that you have a monster about to raise its head, not even laboring under the guilt and awareness of what happened 80 years ago. You know, if you go back to my youth when I was a teenager, so the German people were very concerned about reparations money, and there was a tremendous emotion of guilt among the children and grandchildren of those people. Today you're dealing with a generation that doesn't have that at all, which means a completely fresh renewal of the same anti-Semitic emotions that you had then. That's a very, very scary issue. Now, I agree with you that it's a spiritual problem, and to discuss it more thoroughly, we'd have to go into spiritual and indeed Kabbalistic sources to understand this unreasonable fear and hatred of the Jewish people. But it's important for Jews to know, I think, that this is something that will not be solved on a political level. Let me hasten to add, we need political defense as well. We certainly need military and political advocacy. There's no question about that. And I also would not hesitate to say that historically the Israelis have been pretty bad at that. Part of a Middle Eastern mentality. And it's only in the later years that Israel has paid attention to its political image and to its international justification for its existence and actions. And that carries that as a two-edged sword. On the one hand, we have to do it, and we have to do it well. On the other hand, it's a very deep pain that a country like Israel has to put out a publicity program just to justify its existence. I mean, is there any nation on earth, any country on earth that has to justify its very existence to the International Committee? I mean, that is awesomely prejudiced. So in summary, this is a problem that's not going away anytime soon. Secondly, it's certainly a spiritual question. All the attempts to explain the Holocaust on, political, sociological lines are all fall short, and that applies to modern anti-Semitism as well. Thirdly, the practical side must not be forgotten. We need advocacy. We need good advocates and representatives. We need to up our game in terms of our own inner morality and we need to be cleaner than clean and seen to be clean. It should be taken by us as a stimulus to act in an exemplary moral fashion, live up to our standards of our own religion, right? There's no question about that. How much of the edge that will take off modern anti-Semitism is not clear, but those are clearly the things we have to do. And finally, probably I think you summed it up. It's a spiritual problem, and there has to be a spiritual solution. In other words, not to be surprised and not to be disarmed by a genocidal hatred, not to rest on our laurels. I heard someone say recently, the existential threat to Israel is over now. It's a strong country, etc. I mean, that's a terrible misperception. Let alone the development of nuclear weapons in the vicinity. Israel has always labored under a totally existential threat. I mean, the agenda of the enemies is not just a piece of land; it's total genocidal extinction. I mean, that's on their books. And first line of defense, I think, has to be a deep spiritual awareness and an awareness that the issue is spiritual, which boils down in my field to what we call outreach. That is deep spiritual education of the Jewish people. And we believe at the deepest level that the solution will come from another dimension.
Absolutely. And what do you say to people that, you were speaking earlier about the importance of we should always look to improve our own national standards and moral standards as well, even if anti-Semitism is entirely or largely irrational. It's always good to self-reflect. What do you say to people who you spoke earlier about what people say about Israel, and perhaps that it can't be good for our national soul to be occupying another people? Do you sometimes there can be so much confusion between what are legitimate complaints and grievances made and what are just being fueled by anti-Semitism? How can you separate the two and clarify the two? Do you think there is even something valid to that? Do you think we should always be looking to extend the hand of peace in the Middle East and that kind of stuff? Because if you just assign everything to being anti-Semitism, then sometimes it can lead to a lack of self-reflection.
No, indeed, you're quite correct about that. But let me just say one small point. If you're asking me about the Palestinian and Israeli political Middle Eastern situation, I suggest to you a very important tool that your listeners or your viewers could bear in mind. And I think it's simply a question of reframing. Let me tell you what I mean, and I hope you and your viewers will find this useful. I was traveling someplace some time ago when one could still travel, and I saw a book, a very violently pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli book. And the book began by highly educated Muslim authors. The book began, the frontispiece was a map of Israel. And the map showed, the extent of Israel from top to bottom. And it showed a tiny Palestinian enclave, or the small Palestinian areas. And the map was designed to show a tiny embattled minority surrounded by a massive, powerfully organized, military presence, the cruelest and most bullying fashion, imaginable. So there's your picture. You have the entire picture of Israel, a tiny enclave of some dispossessed and unarmed and totally vulnerable people who could be snuffed out, at a moment of whim by the Israelis. How do you deal with that sort of perception? And I would suggest to you that you acknowledge it, and they say they're quite correct. And here's how I would challenge to give a lecture to an anti-Semitic and anti-Israel audience who put up a poster of that on the wall and triumphantly showed it to me. What do you say about that? I would take their poster, put it up in front of the hall, and then I would continue to draw the map of the whole Middle East around it. And what you would see is a massive swathe of territory inhabited by 500-600 million people, and a tiny speck of embattled, people surrounded by, well-organized armies with endless funds. In other words, their map is totally correct. They just got it at the wrong scale. If you look at a map like that and you see this tiny, almost unidentifiable sliver of land, as big as I said, as a national park in South Africa, surrounded by some of the biggest territories on earth, all with unlimited funds, weaponry, developing nuclear weapons, with a declared intention to wipe you out instantly. Not subtle, not couched in political niceties, totally on the agenda of their constitutions. I mean, I think you'd forgive the people living there for feeling a little threatened, and to have a little justification for their, even if they would be cruelly turning on such a minority within their midst, even if that would be true. I think of reframing the discussion like that is a logical approach. Will this have an effect on the audience? Will they say, oh, you're right, we shouldn't be behaving this way? I don't think so. But I think that Jews need to be articulate. You need to, if you reframe a thing correctly, right? And then, of course, then they would say, well, Palestinian land and it's their land. Well, let's examine our land and our claim to the land. So I think that when it comes to logical presentation, we shouldn't fall short on that either. But as I say, we shouldn't be too invested in that. That will not bring the final, will not win the debate on that level.
And can I ask, what percentage of people do you think can change their attitude of Jews and the Jewish people and Israel based on logic? And to what extent do you just say...
Did you ask me what percentage change we can make?
Yes, because in other words, when you deal with people who are buying into anti-Semitic tropes, it sounds like what you said previously, the majority of your feeling is that this is just something that is deeper than logic. So in other words, how much emphasis should we place or put our hope in defeating anti-Semitism with logic?
So, Ollie, I think very little indeed, but I think that doesn't justify not speaking up in logical and cogent fashion. There are a couple of reasons. The first reason is that there are people on the fence. There are reasonable people around the world who are on the fence. There are reasonable people around the world who don't think very deeply or are very influenced by the media storm against us on all levels. And I'm sure we could make a difference. Would it be insignificant difference or a significant difference? There's no telling. But certainly silence is taken as acquiescence. I think that's wrong. When there's a moral position to be made, I think you have a duty to make that point, even in the face of cruel enemies who will not register it. We should never be accused of having condoned a situation or tacitly accepted something. I think this is an important rule. When parents are dealing with a child who's acting out and misbehaving, not following the rules of the family, and the parents know that the child is going through an immature phase where no amount of argument will succeed, it's still very important to make the correct moral points. They'll come home to roost at some point. And therefore, when you have a correct moral statement needs to be made, and a correct justification, at the same time as an open admission of where we're wrong. Absolutely, why not? When we make mistakes, if we do things that are wrong, and whether they're Israeli military mistakes or political mistakes, or absolutely we don't claim to be perfect. I think it's a sign of strength to make those admissions, but at the same time to make a very cogent presentation of what's right about us. And one final point, if I may, since this discussion is your fault and not mine, I would say this: there's nothing more odious than Jews denouncing Israel outside Israel. Let me be clear about that. There's nothing more offensive than Jews denouncing Israel outside Israel. You want to criticize the Israeli government? Let me hasten to add, I'm no supporter of Israeli governmental and secular policies. That's not the point. The point is, it's the homeland of the Jewish people, and it's totally existentially necessary and totally existentially vulnerable. We saw that so powerfully, so recently. It's still living memory. You can go back to that. And therefore, a Jew to get up on the streets of London and make pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli statements in the non-Jewish, first of all, it looks so ridiculous. What kind of a traitor? What kind of a person sells out his own family, no matter whether they're right or wrong? If you disagree with Israeli morality and politics, by all means, go there and rail against it in the streets and as vocally as you wish. Take part in it and try to make a change. Absolutely, you can be as vocal as you like. But to get up in the streets of the secular world, the non-Jewish world, and denounce your own people and your own homeland, I mean, it's just it's beyond understanding to see the demonstration of such treachery. Again, that doesn't mean you support them on every issue that you consider to be a mistake or immoral. But there's just a certain loyalty to family that should be obvious.
I actually heard someone say to me, an excellent Israel advocate, he said that he often explains that kind of action from some Jewish people as a way in which someone might respond to an abusive partner. Some stand up and fight against, some stay silent, and other people justify the action. So instead of, he says, I'm not so sure in what they're doing is treachery, but perhaps it comes from internalized trauma of generations of anti-Semitism that they end up just justifying the anti-Semitism.
Ollie, I would not like to venture an opinion about the psychology of people who do that. I think it's Whatever the psychology may be, I think it's offensive and unjustifiable.
I just wanted to finish this by asking, you said it's a spiritual problem ultimately. Are there any practical spiritual things that we can do in response?
We can sum it up in one word as tshuva, which means coming back to our genuine Jewish identity. That is a genuine Jewish cultural, religious, deep spiritual attachment. You can sum it up as the word tshuva, and if you like, you can sum it up as the word God. Now, I don't think we'll have success overnight convincing the Jewish secular masses about that. We may make some progress in showing them that it's certainly not in human hands. I don't have to remind you that there are 4 or 5 individuals around the world who hold the power to annihilate basically the known world with nuclear, the Holocaust. And I think it's near miraculous that over some bottle of vodka or some drunken Washington or Moscow party, it hasn't happened yet. Anybody with any sense should see the vulnerability at that level. If that doesn't make you believe in God holding things back, I don't know what will.
To stay up to date with JTV content, click subscribe here if you're on YouTube and hit the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, hit the like button, and under following, click see first. If you enjoy watching JTV content and want to help us continue to grow, please consider making a donation to us by clicking here.